Imagine standing at the edge of a city that has never been conquered. A city perched on a hill surrounded by valleys so deep, so steep, that every enemy who ever tried to take it turned back and walked away. A city so confident in its protection that its people called it the navel of the world, the place where heaven touched earth. Now imagine watching that city burn, watching the smoke rise so high it can be seen from miles away, watching the most beautiful building ever constructed in the ancient world crumble stone by stone, watching soldiers carry out objects so sacred, so precious that even the priests who served inside were not allowed to touch them with bare hands. This is not a myth. This is not a legend. This happened, and the man who ordered it, the man who made it all possible, was a king so powerful that the ancient world called him the King of Kings. His name was Nebuchadnezzar, and what he did to Jerusalem in 586 BC changed the history of an entire people forever. But here is the thing about this story that most people miss. This was not just a military campaign. This was not just one empire crushing another. This story is about what happens when a civilization loses its way, about what happens when the very thing meant to protect a people becomes the thing they trust instead of what it represents, and about a king who, despite being the instrument of one of history's greatest destructions, ended up being one of the most complicated and fascinating rulers who ever lived. To understand how Nebuchadnezzar destroyed Solomon's temple, you have to go back, way back, because the temple didn't just appear out of nowhere. It was the result of a dream that took generations to build. When the Israelites first came to Canaan, they did not have a temple, they had a tent, a portable, movable structure they called the tabernacle, and inside it they kept the most sacred object in their world, the Ark of the Covenant. This was the wooden chest covered in gold that, according to their scripture, housed the very presence of God. The tablets of the 10 Commandments were inside it, the staff of Moses' brother Aaron, a jar of manna from the wilderness. This was not just a religious artifact to these people, it was the center of their identity, the physical anchor of their faith. For hundreds of years this tent traveled with them. It sat in different cities, it was moved during battles, it was captured once by the Philistines and returned, and for the longest time that was enough. But then came a king named David, and David looked around at his palace, a palace built from the finest cedar of Lebanon, decorated with gold and carved ivory, and he felt something close to shame. He had built himself a house of cedar, but the God he worshipped was still living in a tent. He wanted to fix that. He wanted to build something permanent, something so magnificent that no one who ever laid eyes on it would doubt the seriousness of the people it was built for. God told David he would not be the one to build it. His hands had shed too much blood in war, but David's son Solomon would build it. And everything David had conquered, everything he had accumulated, the gold, the silver, the timber, the wealth of a kingdom at its peak, would go toward making it the most spectacular structure the ancient world had ever seen. Solomon took that assignment seriously. He hired Hiram, the most skilled craftsman and architect in the region, who came from the Phoenician city of Tyre. He conscripted tens of thousands of workers. He brought in cedar wood from Lebanon, the most prized timber in the ancient world. He sourced the finest quarried stone, and for 7 full years the construction of the temple in Jerusalem consumed the resources of an entire kingdom. When it was finished, what stood on Mount Moriah in Jerusalem was extraordinary. The structure itself was not enormous by modern standards, about 90 feet long, 30 feet wide, and 45 feet tall, but size was never the point. Every surface was covered in gold. The walls, the floors, the ceiling, the innermost room, a perfect cube they called the Holy of Holies, was lined entirely in pure gold. The 2 massive bronze pillars at the entrance, named Jachin and Boaz, stood over 27 feet tall. The bronze sea, a giant basin supported by 12 bronze oxen, held thousands of gallons of water for the ritual cleansing of the priests. There were lampstands of pure gold, altars of gold, utensils of gold. The sheer weight and value of what was inside that building was almost incomprehensible, and at the very center of it all, in the Holy of Holies, sat the Ark of the Covenant, protected by 2 enormous golden cherubim, whose wings stretched across the entire room, tip to tip. Solomon dedicated the temple with a prayer so long and so detailed that scribes preserved every word of it. He asked that this place serve as a house of prayer for all peoples, not just the Israelites. He asked that when his people sinned, when they turned away, when they suffered the consequences, that this place would remain as an anchor they could return to, a reminder of who they were and what they were called to be. That prayer turned out to be more prophetic than Solomon may have realized. The problem with building something perfect is that perfection is hard to maintain, and the history of the Israelites after Solomon is essentially the story of a people slowly drifting from the very ideals that built the temple in the first place. Solomon himself started the slide. He had 700 wives and 300 concubines, many of them foreign princesses brought in through political marriages, And as he aged, he built altars and shrines to the gods of his foreign wives. The man who built the house of the Hebrew God was also building houses for Chemosh, Molech, and Ashtoreth. The books of Kings don't spare him. They say his heart turned away. After Solomon died, the kingdom split in two. The northern kingdom kept the name Israel. The southern kingdom, which held Jerusalem and the temple, was called Judah. And over the next several centuries, both kingdoms cycled through kings, some faithful, some corrupt, most somewhere in between, while the prophets screamed warnings into the wind. Prophets like Isaiah, Jeremiah, Micah, Ezekiel. These were not gentle voices. They were people who stood in public spaces and said things that made powerful people furious. They warned that if the nation continued down the road it was on, the corruption, the injustice, the empty religion that performed rituals without any real transformation, then the protection the people believed they had would be stripped away, and there was a particular kind of false comfort that the prophets pushed back against harder than almost anything else. Many people in Jerusalem had come to believe that the temple itself was a kind of magical shield, that as long as the building stood, the city was safe, that God would never allow his own house to be destroyed. The prophet Jeremiah walked into the temple courtyard and told the people directly, "Do not trust in the words, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. The building is not protected. The building is a symbol, and symbols without the substance behind them are just stone and gold." Nobody wanted to hear that. And then Babylon came. By the late 600s BC, a new empire had risen in Mesopotamia, in the land that is now modern Iraq. The Babylonian Empire under King Nebuchadnezzar had broken the power of Assyria, the empire that had already destroyed the northern kingdom of Israel over a century before. When Nebuchadnezzar died, his son took the throne. That son was Nebuchadnezzar II. He is one of those historical figures who is so large that it is genuinely hard to fit him into a single frame. He was a military genius. He was a builder on an almost impossible scale. The famous Hanging Gardens of Babylon, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, are attributed to him. He was ruthless when he needed to be, and strategically merciful when mercy served him better. He did not simply destroy the kingdoms he conquered. He absorbed them. He moved their elites, their scholars, their craftspeople to Babylon. He wanted to build an empire of talent, not just territory. And early in his reign he looked west. He looked toward Judah. Judah had made a catastrophic mistake, a mistake that small kingdoms have been making throughout history when a massive new power rises next door. They tried to play both sides. Judah was caught between Egypt and Babylon. Egypt was the old power, familiar, manageable. Babylon was new, terrifying and growing. The question for every king of Judah during this period was, who do we bet on? And different kings kept changing the answer. Ally with Egypt, submit to Babylon, switch back to Egypt, promise tribute to Babylon, pay it, then stop paying it. This is not a strategy. This is a prayer that no one notices you. Nebuchadnezzar noticed. He came to Jerusalem for the first time around 605 BC. And at this point he wasn't there to destroy. He was there to make a point. He took hostages from the royal family and the nobility, young men of the best families, educated, talented, politically valuable. He took them back to Babylon and had them trained in Babylonian culture, language and administration. He wanted them to be useful, not dead. Among those hostages was a young man named Daniel. He also took treasures from the temple, not everything, just enough to make clear who was in charge now. Judah submitted, for a while. Then a new king named Jehoiakim stopped paying tribute and rebelled. Nebuchadnezzar came back. He took more hostages, more treasures, more gold from the temple. He installed a new king, a boy named Jehoiakim, just 18 years old, and 3 months later came back again, when Judah rebelled a second time. This time, Nebuchadnezzar took Jehoiakim himself to Babylon, along with thousands more, the soldiers, the craftsmen, the smiths, the leaders. He left only the poorest people behind, and installed yet another king, Zedekiah, a man he thought would be compliant. He was not. Zedekiah made the same mistake as his predecessors. He sent envoys to Egypt. He stopped paying tribute. He whispered with neighboring kingdoms about forming a coalition against Babylon. And when Nebuchadnezzar found out, and he always found out, he had reached the end of his patience. In 589 BC, the Babylonian army marched toward Jerusalem for the last time. The siege of Jerusalem lasted 18 months. 18 months. Think about what that means. The Babylonian army set up camp around the entire city, cutting off every supply route, every source of food, every attempt at resupply. The walls of Jerusalem were strong. The city had water from cisterns and the Gihon spring. But no city can hold out forever when every road in and every road out is blocked. Inside the city, the situation became desperate in ways that ancient texts describe in terms that are almost unbearable to read. Famine set in. The wealthy began selling everything they had for food. Then there was nothing left to sell. Jeremiah, who had been warning about this for decades, sat in the prison courtyard where Zedekiah had locked him up, still dictating words to his scribe, still insisting that the right thing to do was surrender. He said that resistance now was not faithfulness, it was stubbornness in the face of something that was already decided. Nobody listened. In July of 586 BC, the Babylonians breached the walls. Zedekiah fled at night with what remained of his army, slipping through a gate near the royal garden, heading east toward the Jordan River, trying to reach the desert. The Babylonian forces caught him near Jericho. They brought him to Nebuchadnezzar, who was camped at Riblah in the north. What happened next was designed to be unforgettable. Nebuchadnezzar had the sons of Zedekiah, his heirs, the future of his dynasty, killed in front of him. Then, while those images were still fresh, while that was the last thing Zedekiah had seen, Nebuchadnezzar had his eyes put out. Blind, in chains, he was taken to Babylon, where he would die in prison. Nebuchadnezzar understood something about power and memory. He wanted the last thing the king of Jerusalem ever saw to be the destruction of everything he had tried to protect. Then Nebuchadnezzar sent his commander, a man named Nebuzaradan, to finish the job. Nebuzaradan arrived in Jerusalem 1 month after the walls were breached. What he did was systematic, methodical, and total. He burned the temple. He burned the royal palace. He burned every significant building in Jerusalem. He tore down the walls. The fire in the temple would have been devastating to witness. All that cedar wood, the same ancient timber that Solomon had hauled from Lebanon, consumed in flame. The gold is melting, the carved cherubim and the decorative pomegranates and lilies and palm trees, all of it blackening, warping, collapsing. But before the fire, the soldiers stripped it. Every object of value that could be carried out was carried out, and the list of what was taken reads like an inventory of the ancient world's most sacred collection of objects. The bronze pillars, Jachin and Boaz, those massive columns that had stood at the entrance of the temple for 400 years. They were too large to move whole, so the soldiers broke them apart. They cut them into pieces and loaded them onto wagons, carried them back to Babylon. The Bronze Sea, the great basin supported by the 12 bronze oxen, was smashed apart and taken. The 10 bronze water carts, the shovels, the basins, the snuffers, the bowls, the dishes, everything made of bronze and gold and silver that had been used in temple worship for centuries. The books of Kings and Jeremiah both try to account for it all. They describe the weight of the bronze taken from the pillars alone. It was beyond counting. They list item after item, the pots, the shovels, the lampstands, the gold bowls, the silver basins. All of it was taken to Babylon, and the Ark of the Covenant. This is one of the great mysteries of ancient history. The Ark is mentioned in exhaustive detail throughout the Hebrew scriptures up until this moment, and then it simply disappears. After the destruction of the temple, it is never mentioned again in any definitive way. No one loaded it onto a Babylonian wagon, at least not in any account that survives. No Babylonian inventory lists it among the spoils. No later biblical text says it was recovered. It simply vanishes from the historical record. Some scholars believe it was hidden before the Babylonians arrived, that priests who saw the siege coming smuggled it out, or buried it somewhere beneath Jerusalem or in the desert. Jewish tradition holds that it may be hidden beneath the Temple Mount itself, in tunnels or chambers carved from the rock. Others believe it was destroyed in the fire. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church claims it was taken to Ethiopia generations earlier by Menelik, the son of Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. Indiana Jones had his own theory, but that one does not appear in the academic literature. The truth is, no one knows. And the not knowing has fueled 25 centuries of searching, theorizing, and dreaming. What we do know is that Nebuchadnezzar's soldiers carried the remaining sacred vessels of the temple back to Babylon and placed them in the temple of his god Marduk. It was a standard ancient practice. When you defeated a people, you demonstrated the superiority of your gods by placing the sacred objects of the conquered in your own temple. Their gods were trophies now. Their holiest things were decorations in a foreign house of worship. For the people of Judah, this was not just a military defeat. It was a theological crisis of the deepest kind. Everything they had been told about who they were, about the protection they had, about the meaning of their existence, all of it was suddenly standing in a smoking ruin. What happened to the people is as important as what happened to the building. Nebuchadnezzar deported the survivors to Babylon in waves. The Babylonian exile, which the Jewish people would observe and mourn for the next 70 years, was not a death march. It was a forced relocation of the educated, the skilled, the priestly class, the leaders. The Babylonians wanted human capital, not corpses. Most of the exiles ended up in settlements near the rivers of Babylon, in places where they were allowed to build homes, plant gardens, maintain community, even hold property and do business. But they were not home, and home, Jerusalem, The temple, the specific geography of their faith, was gone. There is a psalm that comes from this period that has survived thousands of years because the emotion in it is simply too raw and too human to ever become outdated. It is Psalm 137. It begins, "By the rivers of Babylon, we sat and wept when we remembered Zion. On the poplars there we hung our harps, for there our captors asked us for songs. Our tormentors demanded songs of joy. How can we sing the songs of the Lord in a foreign land?" That is the sound of people trying to figure out who they are when everything they used to use to define themselves has been taken away. And here is what is remarkable, what is, by any measure, one of the most extraordinary cultural and spiritual achievements in all of human history. They figured it out. In Babylon, without the temple, without the sacrificial system, without the physical place their entire religious life had been organized around, the Jewish people did something radical. They internalized their faith. They began meeting in small groups, what would become the synagogue system. They wrote, they compiled, they were preserved. Scribes and priests and scholars gathered the oral traditions and the written fragments and began assembling what would become the Hebrew Bible. The Torah was edited and formalized during this period. The prophets were compiled. The historical books were written. The exile, which looked like the end of everything, turned out to be the crucible in which the enduring form of Judaism was forged. The Babylonians thought they had destroyed a people's religion by destroying their temple. What they actually did was force that religion to evolve into something that did not need a building to survive. Now, about Nebuchadnezzar, because there is a part of this story that rarely gets told, and it is strange, and it is haunting, and it changes the way you think about this king who set fire to the holiest building in the ancient world. In the book of Daniel, which tells the story of those hostages taken to Babylon in 605 BC, including the young man Daniel, there are several remarkable accounts of Nebuchadnezzar's encounters with the god he was supposed to be an enemy of. The first is the story of the fiery furnace. 3 of the Jewish hostages, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, refused to bow down to a massive golden statue Nebuchadnezzar had built of himself. In his fury, he had them thrown into a furnace heated so hot that the soldiers who threw them in were killed by the heat. And then, according to the text, he saw not 3 figures walking inside the fire, but 4. And the 4th, he said, looked like a son of the gods. He called them out. He saw they were unharmed. And in that moment, this builder of empires, this destroyer of cities, issued a proclamation across his kingdom that no one should say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. The second encounter is even stranger. Nebuchadnezzar had a dream of a great tree that grew tall enough to reach the sky, visible from the ends of the earth, full of fruit that fed every creature. And then an angel came and called out to cut it down, strip its branches, scatter its fruit, drive the man who was the tree away from human society until 7 years had passed. Daniel interpreted the dream. He told Nebuchadnezzar the tree was him. The king of the greatest empire in the world would be stripped of his reason, driven away from people, would eat grass like an ox, would be drenched by the dew of heaven, until he acknowledged that it is God who rules over human kingdoms and gives them to anyone he chooses. 12 months after that dream, as Nebuchadnezzar walked on his palace roof in Babylon, looking out at the city he had built, he said, "Is this not the great Babylon I have built as a royal residence, by my mighty power and for the glory of my majesty?" And the text says the words were still in his mouth when a voice came from heaven, and everything the dream had promised happened. He was driven away from people. He ate grass like an ox. His hair grew like the feathers of an eagle. His nails are like the claws of a bird. And at the end of that time, when his sanity returned, Nebuchadnezzar raised his eyes to heaven and praised the God of the Jewish people. He acknowledged a power above his own. The man who had ordered the burning of the temple ended up, according to this account, bowing before the God whose temple he had burned. You can approach this story in different ways depending on where you come from. But whatever you believe about its literal truth, the very fact that it exists, the fact that the biblical writers preserved this story about the most destructive enemy their people had ever faced, says something profound about how they processed what happened to them. They were not writing a simple story of good versus evil, of righteous people and wicked enemies. They were writing something far more complicated, something about the possibility that even the worst human beings in history are still operating within a larger story they can't fully see or control. The temple was gone, but Jerusalem was not finished. 70 years after the exile began, the Babylonian Empire fell to a new power, the Persians under Cyrus the Great, and Cyrus made a decision that surprised everyone. He issued a decree allowing the Jewish exiles to return to their homeland and rebuild their temple. This is recorded in the book of Ezra. It is also recorded in Cyrus's own words, on a clay cylinder that now sits in the British Museum, a document in which he describes himself as a liberator of peoples, restoring their gods and their sacred sites to where they belonged. The returnees went back to Jerusalem. They found a city in ruins. ruins, the walls are still broken, the Temple Mount is still bare, the land overgrown. Most of the people who had stayed behind knew nothing of the temple or the traditions of their ancestors. The returning exiles had to start from nothing. They began with the altar, then the foundation of a new temple. When that foundation was laid, the old men who had seen Solomon's temple as children, who had somehow survived 70 years of exile and made the long journey home, when they saw the foundation stones set in place, they wept so loudly that people couldn't tell the difference between the sound of the weeping and the sound of the shouting for joy. The second temple was eventually completed and dedicated in 5016 BC, 70 years almost to the day from when the first one was destroyed. It was not as magnificent as Solomon's temple. Everyone knew that. The prophet Haggai told the people directly, "Who remembers this house in its former glory? How does it look to you now? Does it not seem like nothing?" But he also promised something extraordinary, that the glory of this latter house would be greater than the glory of the former. That temple would stand, be desecrated, be rededicated, be massively expanded by Herod the Great, and continue to serve as the center of Jewish life for another 580 years, until 70 AD, when Roman legions under the Emperor Titus besieged Jerusalem, burned the temple a second time, and carried the sacred vessels to Rome, where they were displayed in triumph through the streets of the city. The relief on the Arch of Titus, which still stands in Rome today, shows Roman soldiers carrying the golden menorah from the temple through the streets. You can go see it right now if you want. History frozen in stone. The temple was never rebuilt again. To this day, the holiest site in Judaism is not a building but a wall, the Western Wall. What remains of the retaining structure Herod built around the Temple Mount. People stand at it, press their hands against its ancient stones, write prayers on small pieces of paper and push them into the cracks. Not because the wall itself is sacred, but because of what it remembers, because of what once stood on the other side of it. So what do we do with all of this? Here is what I keep coming back to. Nebuchadnezzar set fire to a building. He carried off its treasures. He scattered its people across a foreign land, and by every conventional measure, he won. The empire he crushed was gone. The building he burned never fully recovered its original glory. The people he exiled never rebuilt the civilization that had produced it. But the thing that building represented, the idea at the core of it, not only survived, it spread. The Jewish people went into exile with a faith attached to a specific place, and came out with a faith that could be practiced anywhere on earth. The books they wrote in Babylon became the foundation of two of the world's largest religions. The stories they told about their God, about justice and mercy and human dignity, became the moral foundation of Western civilization. The Babylonian Empire, the empire that destroyed the temple, is gone. Nebuchadnezzar's magnificent city of Babylon is dust and ruins in the desert of modern Iraq. The golden statue he built of himself has not been seen in 2,500 years, but people still gather at the Western Wall. People still read those psalms written by the rivers of Babylon. I still feel the weight of them, still find themselves somewhere inside them. There is a particular kind of power that no army has ever been able to conquer. It doesn't live in buildings. It doesn't depend on gold or cedarwood or armies of priests. It lives in stories, in memory, in the stubborn human refusal to let the things that matter most be reduced to rubble, even when the rubble is all you have left. Nebuchadnezzar was the most powerful man in the world when he destroyed the temple. He built the greatest city the ancient world had ever seen. He conquered everything he looked at.